standing in the place of honor. The prince appears at the head of this foreign race, the hawk of the land of Abishah, who approaches respectfully and offers to Khnum Hatep a magnificent wild goat. I want one too. Behind their chieftain appear bearded men, armed with spears, bows, and clubs, women in the bright-colored dress of the Amu, with their children and donkeys laden with goods and chattels of the immigrants, whilst a member of the little band calls forth with the plectrum harmonious tones from his antique lyre. The paint in question was an article much in request, as the Egyptians used it to blacken their eyebrows, etc. Khnum Hatep's descent appears to have received many honors, his oldest son next being made governor of the Canopolitan nome, situated in the north of the nome of Ma, and also of the southern land, which apparently embraced several nomes. Ra Xa Ka'u Usertsen the Third was a name of high renown in the most glorious period of the Egyptian Empire, for this king distinguished himself above all his predecessors by his power and wisdom. The Egyptians themselves believed that they honored the great king Usertsen III best by regarding him as the god to whom they built temples and offered sacrifices. His martial deeds began by expeditions directed against the inhabitants of the Negro land of Kush in hopes of placing an insurmountable barrier in the way of their inroads. All his predecessors had extended their campaigns comparatively far southward, but the complete subjection of the people was far from being accomplished. An inscription in the island of Elephantine names the precise time when the king took the field to smite the miserable land of Kush. In the region beyond the second cataract, Usertsen built sanctuaries and fortresses commanding both banks of the river. The remains of which still exist in strongholds of Semna and Kummeh. Two pillars covered with long inscriptions served formerly as boundary marks between the Egyptian Empire and the Negro land called Heha. They were set up on the territory of the above-named fortresses by the order of the Usertsen III. The inscription on the older stone begins thus. I mean, they're in Africa, you know, the Negro land. It's like, okay. It just sounds super weird to me anyways. Here is the southern frontier, which was fixed in the 8th year under the reign of King Usertsen III, the dispenser of life forever, in order that it may not be permitted to any Negro to cross it, with the exception of the ships which are laden with cattle, goats, and donkeys belonging to the Negroes, and except the Negroes whom come to trade by barter in the land of Aachen. To these, on the contrary, every favor shall be allowed, but otherwise it shall not be permitted to any vessel of the Negroes to touch at that land, on its voyage evermore. Well, Niger, yeah, people are actually not just brown skin, but black skin. So one understands the differences. The second inscription runs thus: every one of my sons who maintains this boundary which I have fixed shall be called my son, who is born of me. My son is like the protector of his father, Horus, like the preserver of the boundary of his father, Osiris. But if he abandons it, that he does not fight upon it, he is not my son. He is not then born of me. I have caused my own image to be set up on this boundary, which I have fixed, not that ye may worship it upon it, but that ye may fight upon it. Well, there's the Chara or something like that, a cult in California. I don't know if it's still active. I had communication with them, and they saw these different forms and stuff as just symbolic. The persona of God would be Horus, her. Yasur would be the, sort of the placement, sort of like the dot in the center of the psychological diagrams. The one who's aware of the whole thing. So in that context, you can think of these things different, or whatever your choices of beliefs are. I've talked about a lot of things. I know people aren't going to agree with my interpretation on everything, but without doubt, Aachen is the old name of the country of Nubia, called by Pliny Asina, for he mentions it directly after the well-known hill fortress of Permi. Qasr Ibrahim, and gives it a distance of 310 Roman miles from Sion. The invasion and final conquest of the region was not effected without cruelty. Memorial tablets of victory in the 16th year of Usertsen III give an idea of the way in which the war was carried on against the Negroes. The king marched between the Nile and the Red Sea, made the women captives, seized the people who had gone to their wells, drove away the cattle, and set fire to the standing crops. More than 15 centuries after these events had taken place, Jehotimus III erected on the spot where his great predecessor had raised the fortress of Semna, a temple which was consecrated to the memory of Usertsen III, as well as the newly recognized divinity of the country, Tatun, a special form of the ram-headed Knem of Elephantine. Altars were also dedicated to them and sacrifices instituted, which were to be offered yearly on the great feast by the priests of the temple of Semna. There are a great number of memorials and inscriptions dedicated to the memory of King Usertsen III, which originate from the officials who lived in his reign and were employed in the public works. Ran Ma'at, Yemen Namhat III are the names of the succeeding king, whose remembrance has been preserved for more than 20 centuries by the fame of his works of peace, for he is the founder of the wonderful lake, Moeris, and of the labyrinth. The prosperity of Egypt depending on the fertility of the soil produced by the regularly occurring inundations of the Nile. If these rise above the height which is necessary to convey sufficient water to the land, they destroy the hopes of the cultivator. If, on the contrary, the rising water stops below the required height, sterility and famine are the natural consequence of the drought in all ages. Therefore, the care of the inhabitants was directed to the state of the Nile at the time of the inundation in order that the dams, sluices, canals, and reservoirs, they might divert the mass of water the moment it reached its due height. Excuse me for the burp. As in our day, the rising of the Nile is telegraphed from Khartoum to Cairo in order that preparations may be made for the approaching inundation. So, in the days of Ibn Nimhat and his successors, the southernmost point of the empire, Semna, served as the point of observation. From this place, the news was sent to the lower lying district. On the rocks of Semna and Kumme, the highest point of the inundation was always noted for comparison, and the mark was accompanied by corresponding inscription. Thus, we read at one place on the rock, height of the Nile, in the year 14 under the reign of His Majesty King Imn Nimhat III, the ever-living. From observation made by Lepsius on the spot, we gather that in the times of the 12th dynasty, that is the 43 centuries before our days, the highest rise was nearly 27 feet above the greatest height of the inundation in these days, and the average height of the Nile when Ibn Nimhat III was king surpasses that of our times from about 12 feet. The attention which the king so evidently devoted to the rise of the Nile is proved most clearly by his construction of the enormous basin excavated in the Fayum for the reception and storage of the superfluous water of the inundation. This lake, which teems with fish, was protected on all sides by artificial dams and communicated with the river by a canal, while a system of locks allowed either the influx or the complete shutting off of the waters. The Greeks gave it the name of Moeris because, as they report, this was the name of its constructor, an old king, Moeris, which was a corruption of the ancient Egyptian word Mri, or Mri war, meaning a basin. Moreover, the Arabic Coptic appellation of the district in which the artificial lake was situated, now called Fayum, is easily explained by the older name Pium, the lake country. At last, the investigations of Lenant Bey have succeeded in discovering unmistakable traces of Lake Moeris. He has proved that it lay in the southeastern part of the Fayum, where the depression of the ground and the ruins of ancient dikes mark its site. The same king built in the neighborhood of Lake Moeris that labyrinth so famed in antiquity as a splendid building, as well as the pyramid, his own monument, not far from this edifice. This wonderful structure, which is utterly ignored on the Egyptian monuments, consisted, according to Herodotus, 248, of 3,000 halls and chambers, half of which were above the ground and half below, with 12 covered courts and entrances to which were opposite to each other. According to Strabo, 16, 786, 810. The labyrinth, like the great kingdom in little, was composed of as many palaces as there were nomes, namely 27. Fragments of stone covered with traces of the names of Imenemhat III and his successor, Queen Spetnethru, near the pyramid of El Lahun, are all that remains of this once celebrated building. The Fayum, which in the times of the above-mentioned king acquired through the presence of Lake Moeris a peculiar importance in political point of view, has nevertheless not had the fortune to be specifically mentioned in the inscriptions on the monuments. The reason is simply this: that the province and its inhabitants were detested as being hostile to Yassir, for in the Fayum, Sebek, and his sacred animal, the crocodile, were held in high honor, and the pious followers of Yassir, Osiris, recognized in both the mysterious emblem of the entity Set. Thus is explained the reason why, in the list of the nomes of the district of Fayum, was entirely struck out. There is, in the Giza Palace, a papyrus representing a plan of the Lake Moeris, together with the canal connecting it with the Nile. Round the basin, and the draughtsman has tried to reproduce a number of towns and sanctuaries, accompanied by hieroglyphic explanations, which are of inestimable value for understanding the plan, and for a knowledge of the various places and their worship. By the help of these notes, we are at once enabled to ascertain the different names of the lake with all needful clearness. Sometimes it is called She, basin or lake. Sometimes Shanur, She'uwer, the Great Lake Basin, or Me'uwer. Me'uwer? I have to see characters, right? The Great Lake, from the most usual designation, Sheh. The country was called Tashe, the land of the lake, which Arabic Coptic word Fayum is an exact translation. Another appellation of the lake, including the canal, is Hunt, the water dam, or the wire. The place at which the canal leading from the Nile entered the valley formed by the great mountain basin of the Fayum was called Apatash, the defile of the land of the lake. Here was the opening, sluice of the canal, the Hunt, from which the word certainly comes, the modern name of the place, El Lahun, which lies near the spot in question. The same word is beyond all doubt hidden in the name of labyrinth. The Lapro Hunt, that is the temple at the sluice of the canal. On the western side of the canal lay the capital of the old country of the lake, in which the kings of the 12th dynasty founded temples and raised obelisks to the crocodile-headed Sebek and kindred entities. Situated in the neighborhood of the present capital of the Fayum, called the Medinet al-Fayum, the city bore in ancient times the name of Shat Canal, or Pa Sebek, the dwelling of Sebek. Pierre Sebek, whence the Greek called by the corresponding name of Crocodilopolis, Crocodilopolis. Thank you. The large stones which the architects required for the construction of the labyrinth and other sanctuaries in the district of the Fayoum came from a great distance, Rohan and the valley of Hammat. Hammamat. Hammamat. Okay. Yielded the most beautiful and durable blocks, as appears with all certainty from the inscriptions and the quarries there. Thus, in the second year of the reign of Yemen Namhat III, an official of the same name was sent there for the purpose of quarrying stones for the construction of the monuments of Crocodilopolis, among which is mentioned a statue of the pharaoh 5 cubits in height. In the dreary mines and quarries of the peninsula of Sinai traces the activity of this king's subjects are visible, and inscriptions dating from the 2nd to the 44th year of his reign bear witness to the long stay of workmen who employed in working the mines of Mafkat, emerald, and Chemet, copper. Or is it Chemet? I don't remember the glyphs for this, but the kings of the 12th dynasty were especially zealous in their worship of Yasir and the maintenance of his temple at Abydos. I forget the Egyptian name for Abydos, but to this new and most convincing testimony is borne by a monument discovered in 1875 in that necropolis. It is the tombstone of a certain Sahatep Yabra, who was buried there and who, during his life, under the reigns of the king Usertsen III and Yemen Namhat III, was charged with the care of the temple and the worship of Yasir in the west, and of the jackal, headed guardian of the dead, Anpu. You know, who's usually known as Anubis, but he also, it appears, received orders to arrange the service at the places of the secret mysteries in Abydos, to regulate the feasts of the entities, to superintend the priest, and as a skillful artist to build for Yasir the sacred bari, and cover it with ornamental painting. Yemen Namhat IV and the Queen Sepik the Pharaoh conclude the 12th dynasty. The monuments throw no special light on the history of these two sovereigns. The princess, his sister, was an heiress's daughter, like, oh, how do you say Nit Kurt? I don't remember. Last program, right? At the close of the 6th, oh, well, 2 programs back maybe, and the Fert Yuri at the close of the 17th dynasty. After their deaths, the inheritance of the empire passed by marriage to a new family, and I think we're looking at a contraction here from the original 2-volume set. Yeah, this is printed by an imprint, so even the page numbers is not, you know. So I don't know what year the contraction was made. So before closing this very remarkable period of Egyptian history, it is necessary to take a backward glance at the great events which so signally distinguished the Middle Empire. Under the rulers of the 12th dynasty, the frontiers of Egypt were extended southward to the Second Cataract. Above this, the 2 fortresses of Semna and Kunme formed the frontier towards the Negro lands of Heha and Aken. The peninsula of Sinai was likewise subject to the Egyptian scepter. Officials of the king, supported by an adequate military force, maintained the pharaonic sovereignty in the mountains of Mafkat country. The Egyptians also kept up a very active commerce with the tribes of Libya on the west, and on the east with the inhabitants of Palestine and the adjoining countries. Well, they didn't call it Palestine either, so the immigration into Egypt of people from these neighboring territories is proved by paintings and inscriptions in the sepulchral chambers of this time. The light-colored Libyans descended into the Nile Valley to entertain the play-loving populace with dances and warlike games. The dark-colored inhabitants of Kush served the great lords of the country as slaves, and the Asiatics presented themselves at the eastern frontier to beg for admission in order to carry on trade on the banks of the Nile. The Egyptian Empire appeared to the world of that time as a center of civilization and of progress in the provinces of intellectual, artistic, and commercial activity. Intellectual life flourished at this period. Schools were established all over the country, and a high tone of thought prevailed in the temple colleges. The natural resources of the country were husbanded, and agriculture was thus improved. The land was all divided up into districts, separated by inscribed stones, and registers were kept at the royal palace, giving statistics as to the area, boundaries, and water supply of each known. Temples, pyramids, and rock-hewn tombs of this period abound, and from the latter we learn much of contemporary domestic life in the Nile Valley. In the times which comprise the history of the 12th dynasty, the center of gravity of the Egyptian state was situated in Middle Egypt. Two cities of that territory, Crocodilopolis, the city of Sebek, on the shores of Lake Moeris. The I's are always the E sound, right? Moeris and Herakleopolis, the Great. Aknas rose rapidly to the importance of the extent of which we can only judge by the monuments. Art in its different branches reached a perfection which we cannot better describe than in the words of de Rogue, that long succession of generations, the date which we were no longer able to precisely determine, witnessed various and changing phases in the development of the Egyptian art. Our museums contain examples sufficient in number and style to enable us to follow the principal variations. The origin of this art is unknown to us. It begins with the monuments of the 4th dynasty, the first which we can assign to a certain rank in a state decidedly advanced in many respects. Architecture already shows an inconceivable perfection with regard to working and building up of blocks of great dimensions. Passages of the interior of the Great Pyramid remain a model of exact joiner's work, which has never been surpassed. We are obliged to guess the exterior arrangement and ornamentation of the temples of this first period, and to restore them from the bas reliefs of the tombs or the decoration of the sarcophagi. This style of architecture was simple, but in the highest degree noble. The straight line and the play of the outline and the outer surfaces form the whole force of the decoration. One specimen of ornament alone gives a certain life to these arrangements, namely the two lotus leaves placed opposite to each other, the human form alike in the statues and the sculptures in relief is distinguished by somewhat broad and thick-set proportions. It seems that in the course of centuries, the race became thinner and more slender under the influence of the soil and climate. In the most ancient monuments, the imitation of nature was aimed at with greater simplicity and with a true regard to its proportion. In the execution of the single parts, and the muscles especially stand out more powerfully and are strongly indicated. The human figures preserve this character till near the end of the 12th dynasty. From this time forward, they become more slender and taller. Architecture had already made a great step forward toward ornamentation. We find at this time the first column which of and preserved in Egypt to our days. Thick, fluted, and with simple abacus as capital. They resemble most strikingly the earliest Doric columns. The sculptures in relief, without a trace of perspective in the composition, are in the old empire often of incredible delicacy. They were always painted over with colors. There are examples among them in which the freedom of the attitudes and the truth of the monuments promised to Egyptian art a great future, very different from that which was reserved for it in later centuries. The statues of limestone were often entirely painted. The figures of granite were only touched with color on many parts of the body, such as the eyes, the hair, or also the drapery. The masterpiece of Egyptian art of the Old Empire is a colossal leg of black granite in the Berlin Museum, which belonged to a seated statue of King Usertsen I and was discovered in the ruins of the city of Tanis in Lower Egypt. This fragment furnishes the most sufficient proof that the first Egyptian school was on a more promising track than that of the Second Empire. The engraving of the inscriptions on these first Egyptian monuments leaves nothing to be desired. It is generally executed in relief up to the 5th dynasty. The characters cut in intaglio of the 12th had never been surpassed. The stone obelisks of Heliopolis and the Fayum authorize us to suppose temples of a grandeur and magnificence in harmony with these fine remains of the 12th dynasty. We know, in fact, that one of the wonders of the world, the labyrinth of the Fayum, was constructed by one of these kings. In the histories of art, a depreciatory sentence is constantly pronounced on the artist of these old days, who, when viewed most favorably, is placed on the same level with the mechanic. And actually, art that just so represents reality is actually sort of a height. But they encoded stuff in their art too. It cannot be too strongly insisted upon that such a judgment is founded on complete ignorance of the essence of Egyptian art, or on a superficial view of it, which is unworthy of the judges of art. The art of Egypt is art in the truest sense of the word, as the statues of Ra-Hatep and Nefert, the Sheikh el-Beled, and Khafra emphatically prove. But this art was Egyptian and bound by a chain of traditions and theories from which the artists, though they may have rebelled against it, never freed themselves. Attention has sometimes been called to the fact that history has not transmitted the name of any Egyptian master. This is not true, for the artist was the most honored man in the kingdom. Martesson, who belonged to a family of artists and lived in the 11th dynasty, calls himself a master among those who understand art, and a sculptor who was a wise artist in his art. He relates his acquirements in the making of works of sculpture in every attitude according to the prescribed custom and measure, and he mentions as his particular invention an etching in colors, if I have rightly understood the expression, which is neither consumed by fire nor washed off by water. And he adds the further explanation that no man has arisen who has been able to do this, with the sole exception of himself and the eldest son of his race. There's too many races being divided in there. I kind of side with the 19. The 19 race theory makes sense. 54 is more Eurocentric. That's like most of the races are European. That doesn't make any sense. Much less bigger numbers and stuff like that. That's, Usersertzen, whom God's will has created, but that he has arisen able to do this, and the efforts of his hand have been admired in masterly works of all sorts, of precious stones, from gold and silver to ivory and ebony. Martensen and his son Usertzen, beyond all doubts, opened the age when art was at its zenith under the kings of the 12th dynasty, whose love for it is fully attested by the monuments of their time. Devotional, didactic. To me, this is the peak of art.